Hello! Welcome to my big fancy fourth entry in my JRPGs of the Xbox 360 series on Final Fantasy 13. It's me. I'm FLCL Forever, or Chris, as some of you better know me as. And I just wanted to pop in and contextualize this before you get into the meat of this video. So, if you haven't noticed, it's been about 6 months since I last uploaded an entry in this series or really done anything substantial because I went back to work. Like they went back and they started the school year in earnest, and I'm a public school teacher. And on top of going back to work and getting ready for that, I also completed my master's in biology education project, which was this big undertaking. So between school starting back up, me going back to school, I shelved my 13 video, which has been the full playthrough was captured in August, and I wrote, edited, and recorded the script in late August as well. And so it's just been sitting around for a while until I had the energy left to take care of it, and now really just finally seemed like it was the time to wrap this up. I threw it together. I had to re-record some lines. It's very obvious what were the original lines and what weren't, because my voice has changed because I was at home for a year and a half essentially, and I didn't have to use my teacher voice or anything. So you can definitely hear a lower, more gravelly version of me in some of the line recordings, and it's an interesting project. I'm not sure if it's even any good, but I just got to put it out there for me more than anything else. I want to thank the community on the Action Button Discord for supporting me as I keep on throwing out mentions of the aforementioned Final Fantasy 13 video. I want to thank my buddy Dallas for continuously going, yeah, man, it's going to get done, and when it's done, it's going to be great, because I think the final product's fine. I think it's interesting, so I'm going to put it out there. And really, I just want to thank you guys for stopping in to watch it. Even if you only watch it for like 2 minutes, that's 2 more minutes than everyone else. So, I appreciate you, and thanks for stopping by. The year is 2004. The place? Somewhere outside of Square Enix's Tokyo, Japan headquarters. The activity? Jogging. That's right. Jogging. This is where the legacy of Square Enix's largest franchise's perhaps most controversial entry to date starts to take shape. Coming off of the development of Final Fantasy X-II's International Edition, a group of developers went for a team jogging session. During that session, they shared ideas. They spoke their minds. They probably gave each other sick high fives when they finished. High on endorphins, they would come out with the initial story ideas for the game that would drive the largest video game marketing event Square Enix had pulled together to date. The Fabula Nova Crystallis. That game? Final Fantasy 13. That's right. As promised, it is time to discuss the legendary 13th entry in the long-running Final Fantasy franchise, and the first of the games in this series that I actually played at the time of release on the Xbox 360. As such, this is going to be a long, windy, emotional journey. But before I can fulfill my given focus and push us all towards becoming everlasting crystals, we need to line up a few dominoes. As previously mentioned, the story of Final Fantasy XIII begins with a friendly team jogging excursion sometime in 2004. This event featuring many members of the team that had just wrapped up work on Final Fantasy X-2, would lead to the catalyst that would ultimately morph into the Final Fantasy XIII that we know today. Work began on the game as a PlayStation 2 title by members of the team that delivered 10 and 10-2. The project was, after all, produced by Yoshinori Kitase, who, after directing Final Fantasy X and producing its direct follow-up, had started shifting into becoming the overseer of all things Final Fantasy following the departure of Hironobu Sakaguchi. This was his team, and naturally, he was going to bring them along for his first major entry as the leader of the Final Fantasy franchise. Work on this PlayStation 2 version of 13 would only get so far, with limited information on this version being made available outside of a handful of screenshots shared from what was essentially a super early development build that was full of vague concepts and ideas. What we have existed before the game's major concepts were finalized, as evidenced by the inclusion of Yuna and Riku as placeholder names for the characters shown in these screenshots. All of this work would end up being scrapped in early 2005 as the team was forced to shift gears. The future was coming, and it would not be led by the PlayStation 2, but Sony's follow-up, the aptly named PlayStation 3.
I'm gonna beat you, and it's gonna hurt, because I don't know.
This transition, of course, was caused by the development of the now infamous Final Fantasy VII technical demo for the PS3, which was made by the Final Fantasy XIII team, who at the time was still workshopping their project for the aging PlayStation 2 and its ancient Emotion Engine hardware. The Final Fantasy VII technical demo's massive success raised expectations and convinced the team to move all of their 13 work to the new platform. And with the move to this console meant that new frontiers would have to be traveled. This meant new assets for the HD-ready consoles, new development tools, further refinement of story ideas, and of course, a brand new 7th gen ready game engine. That unwieldy monster of a game engine would eventually be titled the Crystal Tools Game Engine, which started its life around the same time that Final Fantasy XIII was being developed as a massive initiative to create a company-wide game engine. But due to its unique nature and a great many other factors, would only end up being used in a whopping 5 titles. The transition to new hardware by game developers at the same time that Square Enix's software engineers began developing this brand new engine meant that this newly restarted development of Final Fantasy XIII immediately hit a massive series of hurdles. Developers were making assets without really knowing what the limitations of the Crystal Tools were, and the engineers piecing together the engine were stuck between a rock and a hard place, as their engine was supposed to fulfill the needs of every future title Square Enix would produce on these new platforms. Alongside these software issues caused by the ever-evolving engine, the Final Fantasy XIII team would see a massive expansion in size to fulfill the projected needs of the title. This increase in size was unprecedented for Square Enix's management staff, and it led to massive inefficiencies due to poor communication not only between development groups, but within the individual groups themselves. These things combined resulted in Final Fantasy XIII's early development being less than delightful for those involved. Stories of aimless spinning of metaphorical wheels ran aplenty throughout this period of the game's development. Work continued over the course of 2005 into 2006, where Final Fantasy XIII was officially announced alongside partner games Final Fantasy Agito 13 and Final Fantasy Versus 13 at E3 in 2006, with Square Enix's marketing team presenting it as the Fabula Nova Crystallis. These were supposed to be interconnected games that expanded upon the world that 13 would be set in. The way the dice finally landed, of course, One of them became Final Fantasy Type 0, which only minorly references the world of 13, and the other would become Final Fantasy 15, which is largely and almost totally disconnected from the events of 13 as well. Lucky for me, this is not a video about either of those titles, since neither of them came out on the Xbox 360. At this E3, the Final Fantasy XIII trailer detailed some of the ideas that were already locked in place. The lead character Lightning, the battle music Blinded by Light, and some of the world's designs would make it into the final release of this game as presented in this trailer. Some of these aspects, such as the game's vague battle system user interface, would not. This trailer would set the stage for the next major phase in the game's development. It was no longer something being developed quietly in the background. It was real, and it was time to bring things together. The timeline for the game's development post E3 2006 and the start of 2009 is a little murky. We know that the massive team size led to backtracking and poor communication, which hurt team morale significantly during development, and that these huge departments were churning out assets and levels without much cohesion. The words tossed around to describe these periods of time were unfocused and lengthy. It was during this time that members of the team learned that development habits that Square Enix had in the PlayStation 2 era wouldn't be applicable to work on the PS3 and 360 platforms. They were used to crafting every angle of every object in the standard definition era, and many found themselves grinding to the bone to create richly detailed HD assets that would only be shown for a fraction of a second in the final project. All of this work resulted in the departure of many members of the 10 and 10-2 staff, including planning director Toshiro Shushida, composer Masashi Hamazu, and character designer Nao Ikeda, due to various reasons related to the lengthy process of making 13. We also know that the first full feature-complete version of the Crystal Tools engine wasn't ready until sometime in 2007, and by that time it had expanded its scope to support Xbox 360 and PC as well as the PlayStation 3. It's safe to call this post E3 2006 through the end of 2008 the dark period in the process of building Final Fantasy XIII into a fully realized game. It was during this time that Microsoft unveiled during their E3 2008 conference that Final Fantasy XIII would be coming to the Xbox 360 as well, striking fear into the hearts of Sony-loyal Final Fantasy fans everywhere. Truly a dark period indeed. But from darkness can only come a great brightening, and with that we enter the fabled year of 2009. At the beginning of this year, the team received a mandate from the management up on high at Square Enix. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children was being issued on Blu-ray. To complement the deluxe package, they wanted to include a demo for Final Fantasy XIII that detailed all of the elements that the game would have to offer. The decision to make this demo would become the key that caused all of the then unfocused pieces of Final Fantasy XIII to coalesce. It forced the team to really figure out what the game was going to be, what order it was going to play out in, and how the opening hours of the game were going to look. This demo, the Final Fantasy XIII trial version, locked into place what Final Fantasy XIII was to become for the very first time. It allowed the team to figure out just what needed to be done, and the game's location managers, specialized leaders that were in charge of specific locations of the game, were finally given a general idea of what the game would look like from start to finish. This allowed them to hunker down and piece together the final product that would hit store shelves in December of 2009. This trial version, which I have chosen to make available for the world at large via archive.org, is a deeply interesting vertical slice. It presents the opening hour or so of the game with a battle system that is very close to the final game's battle system, though it lacks paradigm shifting and is missing a lot of the pieces that would arrive with the finished product. There are no menus, no access to items, and your playable characters can access every style of ability right from the get go. It being the first real slice of the game to be completed is, of course, rife with performance issues and then some, but almost everything that would open the final version of the game is basically there, including voice acting and cutscene animation. In the months following that demo, further revisions to the battle system would be made and shown to the public in advance. The game's 2009 Tokyo Game Show demo would introduce the paradigm system, as well as the game's summons, the Eidolons. This demonstrated the game in a nearly finalized form in a playable state for attendees. From there, it appeared to be fairly smooth sailing. After 6 tumultuous years in the oven, Final Fantasy XIII was finally ready. It came at great cost, with the manpower required so great that it came at the expense of other Square Enix titles just to ship it. It was released exclusively for the PlayStation 3 on December 17th, 2009 in Japan, and on March 9th for the rest of the world on both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 platforms. For the team that had grinded itself to pieces, it was finally out the door. It is, of course, important to note that the full game was being localized into English as it was being made. This made it possible to finish the game for its Japanese release in December of 2009, and then make some minor tweaks and adjustments for a worldwide Western release in March of 2010. So, with the finished product finally in the hands of gamers, how did it turn out? The answer is fairly complicated. My answer is especially complicated, even more so than usual. You see, Final Fantasy XIII is my favorite Final Fantasy. Playing it during the year of its release with a few friends was a weekly ritual for months, and I hold that particular time period of my life in very high esteem. I credit it with reigniting my interest in the Japanese role-playing game after basically drifting into the realm of third-person action games and Western first-person shooters. In the decade since its release, I've played through all of Final Fantasy XIII basically 3 times, and managed to enjoy it more each time. Because of this huge pull that it has on me, and the decade of thoughts I've had fizzling in this brain of mine, my prep work for this review was extensive. To get ready, I completed one full playthrough of Final Fantasy XIII with about 90% of the side content cleared. I then played through all of Chrono Trigger and most of Final Fantasy VIII, just so I could cover all of the games that Yoshinori Kitase had directed previous to producing the franchise. I even went back and played some of Final Fantasy XIII 2, and honestly, I could have played 100 more Japanese role-playing games to help grant perspective on Final Fantasy XIII, but I had to draw the line there so that I wouldn't literally die. After concluding all of my work, I decided to sit down and write my review of Final Fantasy XIII, and to kind of help organize it, I've cut it into the following sections to help refine my thoughts and keep them in one place. We're going to talk about the game's story, the game's characters, its structure, its battle system, and then we're going to talk about playing it in 2010 and playing it again in 2021. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up with its legacy as an Xbox 360 title and some final thoughts. You guys ready? Let's dig in. Final Fantasy XIII tells a fairly basic story. A group of seemingly random people from all walks of life are tossed together and given a task to complete. The conflict is derived from whether or not they choose to complete the task as assigned, or find a means to go around the simple restrictions they've been provided in order to find a better way to complete said task, and of course, in the process, save the world. This story, however basic it feels, is layered under 6 years worth of world building and jargon that can make it somewhat difficult to digest. The basic constructs of the world are as follows. Mankind is watched over and guided by a group of god constructs known as fal'Cies. fal'Cies are all-knowing, mysterious in origin, and often vague in intention. When necessary, fal'Cies assign tasks to the people of the world, granting them unique powers to allow them to fulfill those tasks. These tasks allow the fal'Cies to carry out their whims on both macro and micro levels using humans as expendable resources. You also need to know that mankind currently resides in a singular biosphere construct of sorts known as Cocoon. Cocoon is a futuristic cityscape that resembles the likes of Coruscant from the Star Wars films and Los Angeles during the time of Blade Runner rather than pre-existing civilizations from Final Fantasy games. It is here that all the needs of humans are met by Cocoon-aligned fal'Cies, who in turn use humans as their tools to accomplish different tasks as they see fit. When these humans are chosen by fal'Cies to accomplish a task, they are physically branded and given the title of l'Cie. These l'Cie are given a vague indication of what their goal is and are granted unique abilities to help them both determine what their task is and how to achieve it. l'Cie are often treated as outcasts. Their branding and abilities seeds fear amongst the humans of Cocoon, who have been intentionally conditioned to treat them as upsets to the comforts of their lives, regardless of what the l'Cie's task is. If a l'Cie completes that task, which is called a focus, they are preserved into everlasting crystal. If they're unsuccessful, they become zombie-like husks, doomed to wander the planet until destroyed. The world outside of Cocoon is known as Pulse. Pulse has its own distinct set of fal'Cies that fulfill the needs of its society. Cocoon fal'Cies have conditioned their populace to fear Pulse and treat the people, animals, and fal'Cies of Pulse as evil. These are the core tenets that drive the world of Final Fantasy XIII. There's a ton of depth stashed away in the game's rather dense collection of information known as the data log, but as long as you internalize these core tenets of the world, the rest of the story kind of falls into place. Essentially, Final Fantasy XIII is about a group of 6 individuals who are branded as l'Cies by a pair of fal'Cies found within Cocoon. Declared criminals by Cocoon's leadership, they're forced into a position where they must go on the run from a military force while also trying to figure out what exactly their task is that they've been assigned by these menacing fal'Cies. As they begin to grasp more and more of what they've been tasked with, they're forced to decide what their role is in an ever-expanding conflict that ends up encapsulating the fate of the planet. In parallel, each of the 6 characters is forced to dig in deep and figure out what motivates them and what role they want to play in determining the fate of the world, and what it means to serve a purpose greater than oneself, even if it isn't by choice. It's equal parts Fast and Furious, Hitchcock, and Lord of the Rings, all filtered through the lens of a team of experienced Japanese role-playing game designers and developers. Once you strip away the jargon, it's a pretty straightforward, long-winded journey in which 6 people come to terms with their current reality and band together in the hopes that they fix something. They split apart into smaller groups frequently, which allows for character-driven moments of reflection and bonding, And then they collide for big events that heighten tension and inject some energy into what can sometimes feel like those segments in the extended cuts of the Lord of the Rings movies, where they're just kind of waltzing across fancy landscapes for what feels like about 6 hours. Ultimately, the band of l'Cie heroes you guide into role playing game greatness are given a tangible series of names and faces that they're working directly against in order to fulfill their focus, but to me, Final Fantasy XIII is a game that's more about its journey than its ultimate conclusion and conflict. The story it tries to tell is fine, but if you offered me $1,000,000 to recount who exactly you were fighting against during the game before I played my third playthrough, I'd probably be out of roughly $1,000,000. There's an attempt somewhere in there to inject greater world politics and military structures, but it really doesn't feel like the core game's focus. Final Fantasy XIII is at its best when it's all about the smaller scale versus the larger one. It's about 6 people doing one really big thing and nothing else. And in 2021, I respect that. In 2010, I enjoyed this character-driven attempt at storytelling. Playing it again this year, having played the likes of Final Fantasy XII, Xenogears, Dragon Quest XI, and even Final Fantasy XIII-2 in the years since, has now made me appreciate some of the tight focus of the storytelling even more, even if it comes at the expense of traditional JRPG staples, which we'll, of course, get to in a later segment. Final Fantasy XIII tells one whole story about a group of fairly normal people growing into one another, and it does it fairly effectively. I love it for that. But not as much as I love the individual character writing in Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII is focused on 6 main characters, and at different points the events of the game are presented from the perspectives of each of these main characters. Spoiler alert, I love them all, even the ones that are the easiest to dunk on. It feels right to start with Lightning. She's on the box art. For people who have never actually played Final Fantasy XIII, she is Final Fantasy XIII. Lightning was designed from the ground up to be cool personified in the vein of Final Fantasy lead characters such as Cloud and Leon. Lightning is a steely-eyed, sharply dressed, frustratingly dense, deeply traumatized military agent. She has trouble trusting others and is deeply protective of those that are closest to her. At the start of 13, we learn that there's really only one person close to her at all, her sister Sarah. Her sister becomes branded by one of the evil Pulse fal'Cie and is taken before the events of the game, causing Lightning to be deeply bitter. She doesn't know how to properly admit that she can't save the one person she actually cares about due to circumstances that are beyond her ability to hit things stylishly with a sword and use her magical finger-snapping powers. Instead, she lashes out at everyone. She's deeply impatient and quick to belittle anyone that doesn't offer up clear solutions to the obstacles in front of her. She's built a large wall around herself, and we get to spend 50 hours helping her break out of said wall. It isn't easy, and it often appears frustrating when played out in front of us, but because of that, she feels deeply human, and I genuinely enjoy her character arc. She starts off cool and distant, and 50 hours later, she's just as relatively cool, but that cool doesn't come from a place of anger and distance anymore, and instead, it comes from a place of love and a willingness to trust others. It owns. Next in our cast of main characters is the lovable beefcake Snow. Snow is Sarah's fiancé, and was with Sarah when she revealed that she'd been branded as a l'Cie. Because of this, Lightning despises Snow and uses him as an emotional punching bag. It is really easy to write off Snow as a dude bro who loves pounding brewskis and riding motorbikes. Really, he's a lot more like Lightning in that he too is suffering from having the love of his life taken from him. In his case, he was just coming to terms with his readiness to commit his whole life to her. He struggles to obtain Lightning's approval as a future member of his family, and overacts as a mean to seek and earn approval from those around him. His arc is perhaps the most subtle of all of the main characters and the easiest to miss, as his tone never softens and his enthusiasm really never dips below 200%.
These people need heroes.
Heroes.
Throughout the course of the game, what he really finds is his self-confidence. At the beginning of the game, he's a leader simply because he's loud, surface likable, and handsome. As the story concludes, he discovers the depth underneath those qualities and learns what it takes to really have to make the hard decisions and the even harder path of having to follow through after making the big calls and having to deal with the consequences. And then we have Saz, who rounds out the frustrated adult trio that not so subtly leads the story forward in a straight line. Saz is the oldest of the main characters, and the one with perhaps the easiest conflict to understand. His kid has been taken from him, and he desperately wants to find him. Now, I will say that not all of us know what it feels like to have a true love or a deep sibling relationship, but every single one of us has been cared for by somebody and can, at some level, understand what it's like when a parent or guardian loses their child. Either we've been lost and seen it in our guardians, or we've seen it. Saz is the straight man against the chaos of the lives of his peers. He's just a dude who was trying to bond with his son, and now he's desperate to do anything he can to find him after he's marked a lessee and stolen from him. He's the only character who comes into the story with what appears to be a fully fleshed out brain, and often has to remind the rest of the party of their limits. He's got that goofy dad demeanor at times. You just know when the game isn't focused on him that he's probably off giving cheesy, stale advice or making terrible puns. He's as delightful as he is refreshing in that he's not a broken individual who requires the journey to shape him into a mature person. He's just a dad who blinked for a second while his kid ran into the metaphorical next aisle at the grocery store. This aisle in reality just happened to have a godlike being down it. Saz rules. He's such a warm, pleasant man to go on an adventure with. He isn't reduced to an obnoxious stereotype or used as an emotional punching bag. He's us, and perhaps the best representation of a regular person in a Final Fantasy type of ordeal that we've seen to date. In my brain, these are the adult characters, in that they have strong attachments to the existing world and are presented as people of authority during the game's story sequences. The remaining three members of the cast, even though one is very much adult in age, end up playing major roles in the ultimate conclusion of the grand story, but are treated in a way that uses them more like utility objects. And as someone who has lived a long time and seen a great many things, sometimes that's okay. Not everyone has to take the center stage in each particular story. Our lives are long and complicated. Someone fulfilling a lesser role today in someone's story may fulfill a greater role in their own tomorrow or sometime in the future. For instance, we have the teenage character Hope. Hope watches his mother fall to her death during the chaos of the game's opening sequences. Not having the full context of the moment, he blames Snow for the death of his mother. For a good chunk of the game's first half, Hope is deeply bitter about his mother's death, quite understandably, and takes out his anger on Snow. With the power of dramatic irony, we know that Snow wasn't directly responsible for her death, so instead we're treated to a troubled teen acting out because he doesn't understand how to properly express his feelings around adults. He's cryptic, moody, and ultimately ends up being fairly whiny because he deeply despises himself and his lessee peers for what they've become due to years of social conditioning. Hope is the easiest character to dislike in Final Fantasy XIII because of this. His character arc is fairly straightforward and short as he learns to cope with the loss of his mother and become a more mature individual, but he's also a teenager. Most of Hope's work comes through helping the older members of the team realize their own weaknesses as he works wonders on breaking down Lightning's barriers and helps Snow understand how to better grapple with the responsibility of leadership. He acts mostly as a character reacting to others' decisions rather than making his own, and does so in a way that's fairly believable for a young teenager. Most of us were or are teenagers, and there's no one that teenagers tend to dislike more than themselves. We all know a little bit of what it feels like to be Hope. Either we've been in a position where we've been belittled due to our inexperience, or forced to cope with the loss of a loved one at a time when our brains are legitimately not finished developing. Because of this, Hope comes off as annoying at minimum and unbearable at his worst moments. Personally, as someone who works with teenagers during my daytime hours, he feels authentic. He feels like someone that would fit nicely into a high school kind of environment. Secretly, he kind of rules because of this. And then we have our two lead characters who are clearly from another place and time, as they have rich Australian accents.
Much time together.
Fang, let's go. What's our focus even matter?
What's it matter? You want to be a monster?
I'm not kidding. Their voice actors were chosen to make them sound like they're from distinctly another planet. Their names are Vanille and Fang. I hate to clump them together like this, but they really form one distinct character arc through each other's experiences, and at the same time, they're also kind of the flattest, least developed characters in 13.
Spoilers from this point forward.
Vanille and Fang caused a cataclysmic event through their lessee focus being realized that reshaped the world thousands of years before the events of the game, which caused them to become sealed in everlasting crystal. They're basically living, breathing objects of plot momentum. If Hope had a diminished character arc because of his service towards the other adult characters, then Vanille and Fang basically end up without any real character arc because they simply exist to drive the actual events of the story forward. Their existence contextualizes the events of the game as they're unfolding, and they literally get used as objects in the game's final moments. There's hints of the remorse that they feel for causing Ragnarok during their own lifetimes, and you do visit the town where they once lived, but the game doesn't really do anything terribly meaningful with all of this. Vanille and Fang have the potential to be these incredibly rich characters, but the game never seems to fully commit to their presence due to its sharp focus on forward momentum. I love them less for what they are, and more for what their potential is. There are, of course, a cast of auxiliary characters spread throughout Final Fantasy XIII's world, but almost all of them are one-dimensional trash heaps. They feel intentionally like genuine puppets being strung along by the game's fal'C mechanics, and have little to say or do that isn't directly tied to plot events. Even the major antagonist of the game, the fal'C Bartandalist, is about as flat as a pancake. The lack of even a remotely interesting cast of secondary characters is perhaps Final Fantasy XIII's most straightforward storytelling weakness. I love the main cast of characters, but I've played the game 3 times, and I can't name a single one of the supporting characters. Like, this guy, or this woman. They sure do look cool as heck, but who are they? I don't know. This particular blind spot isn't quite as big of a problem as what I feel is the game's biggest overall weakness, however, its structure. Final Fantasy XIII's biggest flaw is its structure. The story it tries to tell is fairly simple, and it has a cast of mostly solid characters to drive said story forward. The problem lies within how the story is told. A big part of Final Fantasy XIII's development was centered around the idea of attracting Western audiences to keep investing in the Final Fantasy franchise. The world that 13 was shooting to enter in 2009 in Japan and early 2010 in the West was a dramatically different one than when Final Fantasy XII hit the market in 2006. This market had been bombarded by Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, BioShock, Grand Theft Auto 4, Halo 3, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, and even Gears of War. Because of this, director Motomu Toriyama stated in a series of interviews that he and his team took inspiration from the largely linear, set-piece driven Call of Duty 4 and other Western titles of similar structure. Those games are presented more like roller coaster rides with huge rushes of momentum and excitement to keep the player moving forward. Final Fantasy XIII allegedly attempts to do the same exact thing with a dash of turn-based ATB combat. And in the case of this roller coaster, instead of being 8 hours long, like the average first-person shooter campaign of the mid-2000s, you get one that's 50 hours long. The resulting game ends up being a largely linear game which restricts player freedom in favor of orchestrated large set pieces and events to drive narrative momentum. For the majority of the game's average playtime of 50 hours, 13 is a game in which you want to push forward at all costs. The game is separated out into 13 distinct story chapters. The first 10 story chapters, comprising roughly 30 hours in length, are often referred to belittlingly as a series of interconnected hallways. As much as I dislike the reduction of the careful planning and execution of the majority of the game, I cannot entirely disagree. From a level and dungeon design perspective, a lot of Final Fantasy XIII is hallways, open spaces with limited options of movement, and large environments that, due to artificial restriction, you really only get a small taste of. It is not the environments, however, but what happens in these environments that truly makes or breaks one's Final Fantasy XIII journey. Modern Warfare is also a series of hallways, restricted open spaces, and artificially limited vast set pieces, but what you do in those spaces is vastly different than what is typically expected of a Final Fantasy game. What Final Fantasy XIII does far too often in these moments is split up your cast of characters into groups of 2 or 3 while you explore these areas. there are huge swaths of the first 10 chapters where everyone is split up due to personal differences and geographic restrictions that force you to explore environments with much smaller groupings. For much of the early game, this is done intentionally to allow you to learn the game's distinct roles in combat and how they complement one another. But as you slowly push out of the confined world of Cocoon and into the world of Pulse beneath it, these split sequences significantly slow down the pacing of the game in a way that's counterintuitive to the linear momentum-driven design that its developers were inspired by. It works wonders for intense character-to-character relationship building, but because the party is constantly split up, huge full-party story moments are strung between long stretches of often bland enemy encounters and simple puzzles that act more as vague obstacles than anything else. To extend the comparison to Modern Warfare, which also splits its campaign between multiple groups, it'd be like if you had a major firefight with everyone involved every 2 to 3 hours, with the space in between filled with goofy conversations and your crew occasionally gunning down 2 or 3 enemies. Final Fantasy XIII drags significantly during the middle chapters of the linear 10 because of this, and the game never feels particularly as compelling when you don't have the full flexibility allotted to you both from a story perspective and a gameplay perspective of having the full party of 6 to choose from. It also doesn't help that the game ties character ability development to scripted sequences in these first 10 chapters as well, which is something that makes sense narratively, but really just leads to more artificial roadblocks in front of player enjoyment and overall game flexibility. When you complete these first 10 chapters, you're then introduced to the largely open world part of the game known as Grand Pulse. Here, at long last, is the vast open, fully explorable type of space that Final Fantasy veterans are accustomed to. The designers don't just loosen the leash, they rip it off here and let you run free for the first time in 30 hours. At the same time, the leveling structure of the game is finally given to you in full, allowing you to build out your characters in whatever way you'd like from that point forward, at the simple cost of your time and energy, which is required to grind out Crystarium points. Grand Pulse is a bit of a sham. It's a vast space for you to traverse, but there's no human life out there. There's no civilization to explore, just a series of side quests that amount to little more than hunts for larger enemies. It's almost as if they want to remind you that Final Fantasy XIII is the anti-Final Fantasy. There's no towns, no distinct personalities beyond your party. It plays well into the game's razor-sharp focus on forward momentum, but it also leaves your experience feeling somewhat cold and uninviting, you know? To better understand what really rubbed me the wrong way about Final Fantasy XIII's structure, I completed a full playthrough of Chrono Trigger, which has arguably the greatest JRPG structure of all time. Chrono Trigger's structure is so generous and reactive to player choice and pacing that it made Final Fantasy XIII's substantially different pacing and lack of player autonomy feel genuinely gross in comparison. In Chrono Trigger, the player is given full control over party composition almost immediately, and it's never taken away. This, of course, allows you to earn party combo moves that benefit your party greatly in later battles. It also allows you to experience the game differently, with dialogue shifting to match the party makeup, and key plot sequences changing based on the subtle choices you as a player have made throughout the game. Final Fantasy XIII, during its first 10 chapters, seldom allows you to set up your party with any autonomy, and doesn't allow you to make any choices from start to finish that impact the game and its story in any way. In interviews with the developers, it was revealed that this choice was deliberate to allow every player the chance to have the exact same experience as every other player. But it makes it difficult to feel like you're actually playing a meaningful role in the game's world when you can't even change up your party on the fly until 30 hours into the game. Come to think of it, Final Fantasy XII had similar issues in terms of restricted freedoms, but with the Zodiac Age re-release, some of those were lifted and changed around to greatly benefit the game experience. As of the writing of this video, we've yet to get such a re-release of Final Fantasy XIII with those structural changes, and at this point I think it's safe to say that we're never going to. Such is life. Even when you get to take a crack at the open world of Grand Pulse, nothing you do there is reflected in the game world. I know a great many JRPGs don't have meaningful side quests, but in 13, you can finish the game without having participated in any of them. During my second playthrough in 2015, that's exactly what I did. This time around, I finished roughly 95% of the game's optional content all the way through its battle arena sequence at the end of its optional quest lines, and honestly, it didn't particularly enrich my experience too much. Structure is Final Fantasy XIII's biggest weakness. We could talk about how some of its lead characters aren't as important or as story-rich as others, but its linearity and its restrictiveness, like many of its Western AAA contemporaries, is perhaps its biggest downfall. It has the pacing of a traditional JRPG, which just leads to a weird, slow experience that stops and spurts back to life periodically. And when it finally opens up, it does so in a way that emphasizes busy work rather than the feeling of liveliness that many JRPGs use their larger, more open worlds for. On a side note, I have absolutely no idea how every JRPG after Chrono Trigger didn't take more cues from Chrono Trigger. It's been almost 30 years. Catch up, Japan. So, at this point we know that Final Fantasy XIII has a fairly straightforward story, a group of interesting, if not perfect or even wholly complete characters, and a messy structure that makes it feel like a chore for much of its runtime. But these are all conceptual issues. How does it actually feel to play the game? Herein lies the biggest secret Final Fantasy XIII brings to the table. Its battle system is absolutely incredible. Final Fantasy XIII's battle system is Football Manager the video game. Or at least, it can be. It should be. I'm firmly of the opinion that if you play it this way, and by this way I mean using the auto battle, that you will have a vastly superior experience working through even the slowest parts of Final Fantasy XIII. You see, the individual choices in a Final Fantasy XIII ATB battle aren't really that important. You can dig through the menus and plan out each battle to play out just the way you want to, but all you'll get is a longer playtime until you reach like high levels of play, and greater room for mistakes in the minutiae of the later combat in the game, where enemy weaknesses are varied to the point that keeping track of it all becomes an exercise in tedium. In keeping with the vague theme of Final Fantasy XIII being the anti-Final Fantasy, the best and smartest option in combat at almost all times is to rely on the auto battle mechanic, which I know to some is tantamount to believing in ghosts or being afraid of the boogeyman. What you do want total control over is the specific roles that each of your players are using. Like being a football manager, you want to make sure your players are in the correct positions and know the best strategies. And then you need to trust that they can play autonomously to the best of their ability. And honestly, the auto battle in Final Fantasy XIII is really, really good. So the best way to play is to focus on the distinct roles that each character can play. And those roles are as follows. The Commando class specializes in dealing physical damage to enemies. The Ravagers specialize in dealing magical damage to enemies. The Medic class specializes in casting healing magic for your party members. You've got your Synergist and your Saboteurs, which specialize in buffs and debuffs. And then you've got the Sentinel. This class is unique to Final Fantasy XIII, and its specialty is attracting enemy attention and mitigating it via different forms of guarding. Through the end of Chapter 10, each character is limited to a selection of only 3 of these different roles. The combination of these roles, either 2 or 3 at a time depending on how many characters the story determines are in your party, are known as paradigms. If you're willing to trust the auto battle implicitly as I do, the gameplay then becomes all about timely switches between different paradigms that you've set up in the game's menus. It's about understanding what your party needs to do at that particular moment rather than making the actual micro-level decisions that your lead character makes. That you don't even control the actions of the other members of your party solidifies this point. You're the manager, not the employee. If your party needs to deal massive damage to a vulnerable enemy, maybe you switch them into a paradigm that deals magic damage to increase the Wait. We need to talk about the stagger meter. The stagger meter is the driving force behind all the decisions you need to make in terms of paradigm switching. The concept is fairly simple. Each enemy has what's called a stagger bar. You need to fill that stagger bar in order to stun enemies and increase the damage you deal to them. Magic attacks and blocks and debuffs fill the stagger bar, but also cause the stagger bar to drain quickly. Physical attacks deal damage to the enemy and maintain the stagger bar, but don't fill the stagger bar terribly effectively, making them an inefficient use of your resources compared to magic attacks. Once the bar has been filled and stagger is in effect, magic attacks then serve to increase the percent damage multiplier over standard attacks, while physical attacks deal their typical damage magnified by the increase in the percent damage multiplier built up by using magical attacks against enemies. Filling the stagger bar and maximizing damage by effectively switching between different paradigms is key to efficient victory in many of the game's toughest battles. That stun can also be crucial in more hectic battles where enemy behavior is more intense, as it allows you a break to kind of assemble your thoughts. If your party needs to, say, deal massive damage to an enemy that's been made vulnerable due to its stagger being triggered, you ought to switch to a paradigm that has 2 Ravager class characters to deal magic damage and 1 Commando to deal physical damage. Once your percentage multiplier is high enough for your tastes, you would then switch to a paradigm that perhaps has 2 or maybe even 3 Commando class characters to take advantage of that higher damage dealt by physical attacks. You can also switch over to paradigms that emphasize recovery and buffs, or recovery and debuffs, to change the playing field to your liking, or switch into a paradigm that features a Sentinel class character to attract and absorb damage while the party heals or works on building up the enemy's stagger bar. You're really only limited by the classes made available to you, which is driven by the characters in your party at any given time. And this, of course, brings us back around to the game's structure, which often works against the game's meticulously crafted battle system. You spend an unreasonable amount of time in the first 10 chapters with 2 characters in your party. Final Fantasy XIII combat without all 3 characters in the mix is like a pizza without the dough. It's a big slopping mess that is as unappealing to look at as it is to deal with. And during my 3rd and most recent playthrough, I found myself noting just how little fun I had after 2 or 3 chapters with incomplete parties. Managing a party of 3 in Final Fantasy XIII just feels right. Give me a full party and the flexibility granted to them after Chapter 11 begins, and I will lose myself in the dance of it all. I deeply, deeply love Final Fantasy XIII late game combat when you roll the way it's clearly designed to be played with. Beyond the switching of paradigms, characters expand their roster of abilities through what's known as the expansion of Crystarium. Quite literally, the awakening of their l'Cie powers expressed through the progress each player makes towards becoming a literal crystal after fulfilling their focus. The Crystarium leveling system is like a tighter version of Final Fantasy X's original sphere grid. Each character has 3 distinct roles to start with, and each of them spawn their own crystal that you have to expand using Crystarium points earned through successful battles. The only real choice you have is which of the 3 to prioritize first of those 3 roles in your quest to max out each of your crystalline structures. These crystalline structures have hard limits to your progression, and periodically expand as your party comes closer to fulfilling their l'Cie focus. When you start out, your Crystarium is level 1 and small, and has the least options for growth. And over the course of the game, you expand all the way up through level 10, which requires insane amounts of Crystarium to fill out, but also brings the wildest gains and flexibility in your HP and MP and your different abilities. There isn't a ton of flexibility in the early game, but there's at least some attempt at player autonomy in the leveling curve. Last time I checked, Chrono Trigger doesn't give you any choice. So, Final Fantasy XIII 1, Chrono Trigger 0. And it's kind of neat that this leveling is directly tied into the world building and physical character development. But it also took me about 10 years to realize the connection between l'Cie focus fulfilling and the development of the Crystarium. For most players, it'll likely land as just another piece of the menu-heavy character development of your typical Final Fantasy. And that kind of sucks. I wish that they had more clearly explained that. Filling out the rest of the gameplay is several of your JRPG standards. Characters earn distinct summons that they can bring into battle at different points in the story, and there's a full roster of items one can deploy during battle, such as potions, phoenix downs for revivals, and antidotes. The works. You can also upgrade character weapons and items with collectible materials that you can buy from stores at save points, as well as find all over the game world. The summons are pretty cool in terms of the way the story introduces them through distinct boss battles that erupt when a character is in distinct need, But the real star has and always will be the paradigm switching mechanic. I love not having to manage individual character actions, and I'm a huge proponent of the auto battle in every JRPG that has it. I loved setting up multiple decks of gambits in Final Fantasy XII, and I used the macros in Phantasy Star 4 religiously. You're just going to have to deal with the fact that I appreciate pressing less buttons to go through combat. And I love managing paradigms in such a way that allows me to maximize the stagger mechanic. It's overall excellent. It's such a good mechanic that they brought it back for the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I literally jumped out of my seat in excitement when I played that demo and saw that. It was like somebody at Square Enix had finally heard me yelling, "Final Fantasy XIII is good, actually!" I just really like playing Final Fantasy XIII with a full party of 3 characters and a ton of cool paradigms. Not 2. Definitely not on that instance where you only have 1 character. You need all 3. It owns. So to kind of summarize, Final Fantasy XIII has a pretty straightforward story about a group of people being casually tossed together and forced to defy fate in order to save the world as they know it. There's a few key constructs that dictate how the world works, but once you have a grasp on those, the rest of it generally tends to fall into place pretty cleanly. It has a cast of 6 characters, all of whom are baseline okay, but it's clear that 3 of them were fully fleshed out, while the other 3 were more designed as meat puppets of sorts to help propel the story forward and support the big 3, even if Saz is kind of low-key the biggest deal. He really is. He's just as critical to 13 as lightning or snow ever will be. Its structure is pretty rough. It attempts to layer JRPG storytelling on top of the kind of linear, spectacle-driven structure of Western titles such as your Gears of War and your Call of Duties. But it fails to understand that those games move really, really fast and offer limited downtime. Final Fantasy XIII does neither of these consistently, which makes the linear nature of its hallways and enclosed spaces early on feel really tedious. It does eventually open up, but it's a too little, too late kind of band-aid fix. On the flip side, it has really, really good combat that requires a shift in perspective, especially for players in 2010, to really get into. The combat only truly works with a party of 3 characters, no more, no less. It turns you into a coach rather than forcing you to dictate the individual actions of your characters. Learn how the different paradigms work and develop a trust in the auto battle, and you will have a really good time. And at the end of the day, it's ultimately a game about the journey rather than its distinct conclusion. It's clunky, it's weird, it constantly teeters on incoherence, but I love it. I love everything about it. I love how it feels like it's on the edge of collapse at several points. And yet this team of developers and writers believed in it so aggressively that they were able to pull it together. I like Final Fantasy XIII. And that's how I feel regarding the game in 2021, after playing it 3 different times at 3 radically different parts of my life. Each time I've played it, it's meant something a little bit different. Final Fantasy coming to Xbox was perhaps the most exciting event of all time to me, a 15-year-old in 2010. As a child of a middle-class family, I was allotted a single console each generation. Typically, we went with whatever supported 4 players, as I have 3 siblings. We rolled with the original Xbox for this reason, and bought its follow-up, the Xbox 360, for the very same reason. Because of this, I missed the entire 6th and 7th generation of Nintendo and PlayStation games. Xbox was the way to go for me and my siblings. Final Fantasy was unattainable. I'd only heard of games like Final Fantasy VI, 7, and 10 in passing as these big deals on the burgeoning internet forums of the late 2000s. I was introduced to their characters only through the lens of a friend's copy of Kingdom Hearts, which elevated them to near mythological levels in my brain. I wanted so dearly to participate in the mythos, but it was just out of my reach that entire time. Microsoft announcing at E3 in 2008 that they would be bringing Final Fantasy XIII to the Xbox 360 was a monumental moment for the younger me. It was both the first E3 that I watched live video footage of, and it was where they announced that they were breaking down the barrier between me and the legendary Final Fantasy franchise. It was finally my moment. I didn't know it at the time, and I didn't really care that it would take 2 years for it to arrive in my hands, because I was just so excited that it was coming. When it finally arrived, I was 2 years older. I'd nearly forgotten about it. It was the late 2000s, and I was a 13-year-old when it was announced, and I was a 15-year-old when it came out. I'd been swept up in the Call of Duty craze. I couldn't have been further from JRPGs. My access to the news cycle was limited to such a point that I actually missed that it launched. It would be mere chance that a copy would arrive at the secondhand game store where I worked. I took it home on a whim, having heard almost nothing about it in the time since it had been released. Knowing that I had a regular group of friends coming over on Saturday nights during that time period, I pitched the idea of starting it together just for kicks. Everybody who was involved went for it. What followed was a transformative experience that would redefine my relationship with Japanese video games entirely. What started as a one-off casual experience turned into a weekly ritual that would run well into the winter months of 2011. The 3 of us that ended up playing through the game together became deeply enamored with the gameplay. We loved calling out paradigms and rooted for our own distinct favorite characters. We would pause along the way and discuss the events playing out in front of us. One of my buds even started reading the data log in his spare time. We cultivated several great inside jokes regarding dialogue and mechanics from the game, none of which I am willing to repeat. Our friendship during this time was the strongest it would ever be. Final Fantasy XIII brought us together in a way that nothing quite has since. The worst part about this playthrough is that we never even finished the game. We made it part of the way through Chapter 11, and then I managed to lose the USB key that we stored our save file on. It shattered our momentum. It killed it dead in its tracks. Who knows where we'd be today if we had hit those credits together? We may have continued to play games together. We might have stuck together to the point where we became Destiny buddies and ran raids and strikes together. My life might have centered around games with strong social elements instead of single-player narratives played out in isolation. Instead of telling you about how we finished Final Fantasy XIII, I'm writing about how I just finished Final Fantasy XIII this year all on my lonesome. Oops. playing Final Fantasy XIII on my own in 2021 for the third time was a dramatically different experience from that initial playthrough. I don't have much to say about my second playthrough in 2015 when I was in college. I was frustrated and lonely and angry, and I treated Final Fantasy XIII like a cheap meal of warm nostalgia. I've got really nothing insightful to say about that experience. But the third time, after a decade of playing JRPGs, I found myself nearly crushed. All of the insight I gleaned during this most recent playthrough I completed in order to write this video was both feverishly delightful and maddeningly frustrating. Returning to 13 after all this time was like meeting up with an old high school crush, only to learn that she'd spent the last decade replacing her limbs and organs with deflated balloons. In order to form a definitive critical analysis of this game from my perspective, I was forced to look at it under the fiercest of lenses. I managed to walk away with an even deeper respect for the game. My love for Final Fantasy XIII is greater than it ever has been. Learning about what ran dysfunctionally through its very core, while also doing research into understanding why some of it ended up the way it did, has left me feeling enlightened. It's a messy game. It really is. It so deeply feels like the anti-Final Fantasy at times that it perhaps was the perfect Final Fantasy game for me to start with. My ignorance was perfect for falling deeply in love with 13, warts and all. I'm glad that I returned to 13 approximately 10 years later. It needed to be done so I could better understand why this is my favorite Final Fantasy and perhaps my favorite Japanese role-playing game ever made. Playing it again for the third time in 2021 was difficult and weird. And as the first entry of the most popular JRPG franchise in the world at the time, and likely still is today, to hit the Xbox platform, it might be the most important JRPG to ever arrive on the Xbox 360. The announcement of Final Fantasy XIII's coming to the Xbox 360 was, to put it lightly, monumental, both on a personal level to me and to the gaming community at large. Following its announcement at E3 2008, the impact was felt almost immediately across the internet. Hard lines were drawn between Xbox and PlayStation owners, very much in the same way that lines are drawn today on Twitter. Posters at large warned that the release of the game on Xbox 360 would hold it back due to hardware limitations, and Xbox owners declared the hyperbolic death of the PlayStation due to a lack of compelling exclusives coming out during that time period around the end of 2008. If they couldn't even keep Final Fantasy to themselves, what else would they lose during the course of the generation? As I've already mentioned previously, this 2008 announcement was a massive eye-opener to 13-year-old me. After being just out of reach, I would finally have access to Final Fantasy. This was the era before there was Persona, Dragon Quest, and various other massive Japanese role-playing games sitting firmly at the forefront of Western media's attention. It was Final Fantasy or bust heading into the 7th generation of consoles, and I would finally get to taste it. That taste would come at a price. With an engine designed primarily around the hardware of the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360 version of Final Fantasy XIII very much lived in the shadow of its Sony-bound peer on retail shelves. The game shipped on 3 DVD discs as opposed to a single Blu-ray disc on PlayStation 3, and ran at the sub-HD resolution of 1024 by 756, and featured heavily compressed cutscenes, which was required in order to fit nearly 32 gigabytes of uncompressed 720p cutscenes from the PS3 version onto the 3 DVDs. In almost every aspect from a technical level, the Xbox 360 version of Final Fantasy XIII is a lesser journey. Bending and breaking the Crystal Tools engine to work on the Xbox 360 was an impressive feat considering all of the difficulties that creating the engine caused the software team, but it came at a great cost that left even myself, without a terribly discerning eye in 2010, looking for more. And after all of that effort, it appears that its arrival on the Xbox platform wasn't enough to break Sony's hold on fans of the franchise. In April of 2010, it was reported that Final Fantasy XIII's launch was the largest that the franchise had ever seen, with over 1 million copies sold in the time surrounding its March 2010 launch. Unfortunately, the PS3 saw almost twice as many sales of the title, sitting around 828,000, while the Xbox 360 version moved a meager 493,000 in the same exact period. With almost twice as many copies sold on PlayStation, the lack of exclusivity at launch in the West didn't seem to hurt sales for Sony's cell-powered behemoth at all. Over the course of its lifetime sales, that lead would continue to grow. To date, there's been a reported 5.35 million copies sold for the PlayStation 3, while 360 lifetime reported sales sit around 2.3 million. More than respectable sales for the installed base of Xbox 360 owners, but perhaps an indication that the audiences of that time would have needed something more for them to embrace the franchise like Sony's console owners did. It was also, in its day, a strong indication of the PS3's rising presence. In 2008, Microsoft stealing Final Fantasy XIII exclusivity was a clear show of its hardware and software dominance. In 2010, the PlayStation 3 had more than caught up. The PlayStation 3 would eventually go on to outsell the Xbox 360 with a series of exclusive titles, most of which remain well thought of to this day. The damage, however, to Sony's firm grasp over the Japanese video game market by Final Fantasy's defecting to the Xbox 360 platform cannot be understated. These days, many of Japan's largest games see launches on the Xbox platform. Major role-playing game franchises such as Dragon Quest, Tales, and even Kingdom Hearts have made their way to the Xbox platform after many, many long years in which the Xbox brand had been an afterthought. Japanese games these days make their way to the Xbox platform with often little delay and relative frequency. I stand firmly with the opinion that had Microsoft not negotiated for Final Fantasy XIII to get ported, that the Xbox ecosystem would continue to largely be a Western market. In many ways it still is, but it is much better in terms of Japanese presence than it was in 2008. Without the success of Final Fantasy XIII, the Xbox platform might have been permanently relegated to a tier in which it only received a slew of B and C tier Japanese role-playing games, such as Infinite Undiscovery and The Last Remnant. Today you can play Final Fantasies 7 through 15 on the platform, with 14 being the major glaring exception. And you can play most of them on goddamn Game Pass. To further cement its significance to the Xbox platform, it's the only console platform where it's fully playable to this day. It received a full facelift as a member of the Xbox One backwards compatibility program, which it entered in late 2018, with a 3x internal resolution boost on the Xbox One and Series X consoles, as well as a fresh set of cutscenes, fully re-encoded from master files provided to Microsoft from Square Enix. I mean, when it hit Game Pass on PC, Its PC port was either fully or partially rebuilt to improve functionality from its initial release, which had been fraught with issues since day one. Microsoft has clearly put the work in to never let us forget that it took Final Fantasy from Sony's iron grip, and that when given the chance, it will do it the kind of justice that Sony as a platform holder has yet to do. Short of a full official multi-platform remaster, Final Fantasy XIII plays best on the Xbox platform. You love to see it. Final Fantasy XIII is my favorite Final Fantasy. It isn't the best Final Fantasy by any means, but it hit me at just the right time and place to lodge itself firmly in my brain. I loved the combat, the intrigue of the rather sparse world it brings to the table, its music, and its cast of characters, which I feel are some of the franchise's finest. It trips itself up many times over the course of its 50-hour journey, but does so in such a way that only serves to endear itself to me even further during this third trip of mine to save Cocoon. It also, in its weirdness, feels distinctly like a product of the Xbox 360 age. Its developers were attempting to try and embrace the Western market more than they ever had before, and early hit titles on the Xbox 360, including Call of Duty, Gears of War, and Halo, definitely played a major role in shaping the perception of what the team felt Western markets would gravitate towards the most. It was this decision to try and make a JRPG for the Call of Duty crowd that ultimately twisted Final Fantasy XIII into the weird, polarizing game that it has been since its arrival in 2010. All of this, and a pinch of Microsoft's money, I'm sure, led to the game's release on the Xbox 360. That break from tradition for Square Enix is still being felt to this day, and for that I am eternally grateful as someone who's always appreciated the Xbox brand's approach to its legacy and its future all at the same time. As I forge my always changing thoughts on the game into YouTube digestible stone, all I can say is this: Final Fantasy XIII is the game for me. And perhaps after hearing what speaks to me so deeply about it, it can be your game too. And with that, I must depart, for it's time to continue my journey into the realm of Final Fantasy XIII with Final Fantasy XIII 2. I'll catch you all on the flip side. Alright, so if you're here at this point, I just want to thank you for watching. You've stuck it out through this entire damn near feature-length monstrosity of a video essay. Thanks for all your support. If you like the video, make sure to like it. Subscribe if you feel like it. Leave a comment, and just enjoy the rest of your day. I appreciate you.